Howdy, friends. Welcome back to Feedstuffs 365. I'm Andy Vance. We're in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where the Midwest Poultry Convention got underway this week. First time in a couple years we've had a chance to gather at this convention and get together with members of the poultry industry from the broiler, layer, turkey segments, all up and down the value chain. Joining me, one of the experts speaking at this year's convention, Dr. Janice Swanson, professor at Michigan State University. And Dr. Swanson, you and your colleagues have done a lot of research into the layer industry and moving away from cage production in the layer industry. And I want to talk some about your research. But you presented here at the conference on day one. Could you, for friends who maybe missed your talk, give a bit of an overview of what you shared with the attendees?
So a lot of my talk really focused on a lot of different research, a lot of what I did not do. So I want to make sure and to acknowledge the fact that there are many researchers that have been engaged in this research. I was asked to address what we know, what we don't know, and what do we need to find out with regard to cage-free housing. And one of the points is that really we're in the early stages of this. A lot of the work that we have had on cage-free in the past has come over from across the pond, from England and other places where they already have directives in place for cage-free. However, it doesn't necessarily match up with how we raise animals in North America, nor with the genetics that we use in North America. So there are a number of things. We have things like nest space, floor space, looking at nest design in particular, for example. We know that actually there are differences between brown and white hens with regard to the use of nest space. We have white hens who tend to lay throughout the day versus brown hens who kind of synchronize their egg laying, and they like to go in the morning hours. So what are the implications of that? Well, it might be you might have different space provision for brown strains of hens than you might with white strains of hens. You might find more crowding with brown strains if you don't have enough nest space because they synchronize some of their laying. We've had research that has come out with regard to also strain differences in dust bathing, for example. Reason we go into cage-free systems, right, is to accommodate natural behaviors of the hen, particularly those that are pretty hardwired for them to do. Dust bathing is one of them. And so we have found that, at least in some of the research that we have conducted, that brown strains of hens are different than white strains of hens. White strains of hens, they like to synchronize. Now, this is almost the opposite of egg laying. They like to synchronize their dust bathing, and many times when the first time they get access to litter, they're all down there, they're dust bathing, and the space that they use tends to be a bit different when they dust bathe. They will tolerate higher number of hens dust bathing around them, and they will actually collapse their dust bathing space a bit to accommodate other hens, but they continue to complete the full cycle of dust bathing. Brown hens don't do that. Brown hens don't seem to like to have close neighbors when they're dust bathing. If the floor gets too busy with dust bathing, they'll truncate their dust bathing out. So these are some of the differences that we need to look at with regard to the provision, for example, of litter. It might be different for some strains than it is for others. We also know that there's a lot happening on the light technology front. There's pulsated light technology that has come out. And learning more about that. There's been certainly private industry research on that, especially for the organization that is offering that to producers, but there's not a lot of independent research verifying what the results are. It doesn't mean that their results are no good, but it's always good to have public validation of what might be happening. Is that good or is that bad? We also know the positioning of lights is really important within a cage-free system. These birds have to see. They have to see what they're flying up to perch on. They have to be able to navigate the system. There are some places that are really important to have lights, but there are other places, such as nests, for example, that need to be darkened. So producers are asking questions about issues like that. So a lot of what I concentrated on in my talk were some of the questions that producers are asking about cage-free housing.
I'm imagining that when you're talking to an industry audience like this and there are real, dollars and cents decisions on the line, they'd like a lot of certainty, and it doesn't sound like there are any hard and fast rules or simple answers that you can give them that you should do X, Y, and Z and everything will be well.
So what I find is this exchange between scientists and producers are really important because in many ways they feed back to us and tell us What is it we need to be working on? What do we need to know? Some of these producers have been into cage-free for a while. They've learned a lot of things in transitioning, and they're now beginning to find out where the bugs are in the system. At first, it's all focused on the transition, right? Getting there, getting the labor force put together in a way that they understand how to work a system like that. There's many moving parts when you transition to that. Once they get beyond that and they become more skilled with that, that's where they begin to pick these systems apart and be able to give us questions to try to work on and answer. So it's this two-way communication that we find is so important for us, and many times technology is outstripping it all, right? It happens at a rate that we can't even keep up with to a certain extent. So yes, they want some finality to a certain extent, because if you think about it, with the type of legal mandates there are in some states, with the type of mandates that are coming down with customers, they need to know what they have to do, right? And they need to know with what they're being asked to do of whether or not it's scientifically valid to do it. Is there any evidence behind it? So they also need information to go back to be able to have this meaningful exchange with either customers or others who are asking these questions about cage-free.
You mentioned mandates and also customers, because we could be talking about a policy push moving the industry in a given direction. We could also be talking about a market push of a customer, a large retail chain as an example that leaps to mind, pushing you into the direction. The kind of two-way dialogue you described between scientists and producers, do you find that also happening between scientists and those other influencers, whether it's policymakers or retailers, etc.?
Yeah, actually, it probably happens more between the customers and the food industry in general. A number of us sit on the different committees for scientific advisory committees for them. And I know for myself and many of the other scientists in the room, they're always putting themselves out there and saying, this is reality, this isn't reality. This is what you need to find out, and actually appreciative if those customers start asking for input like that, because then you get more of a consistency between the producer and the customer who's asking for things. I'm finding that these days there's a lot more happening that is, in my opinion, more responsible with regard to that dialogue than there was probably 10 years ago, where somebody's doing this and we all have to do it too. It's now becoming a bit richer in terms of the conversation.
When you're looking back to the production level and you're talking about some of the changes or trade-offs you described earlier, that white strains do this and the brown strains do that, and vice versa in some other areas, what do those trade-offs look like with regard to overall production? And is it a case where maybe you need to match your facility, so to speak, to your genetics and vice versa? What does that matrix look like?
So I know you probably have Highline and other people here, and I'd say they're probably really the experts to be able to answer some of those questions. But I do know there's a lot of work going on with that, especially looking at these strains and how they adapt to different types of systems. It's really important. Some of the discussion that was brought up today has to do with customers who have come to rely on eggs of a certain quality with different types of solids or whatever in them, but also asking their producer to we all need to go to cage-free, but they were getting their eggs from a strain that's not known or has been only developed within the conventional cage system. That's a problem, right? You can't just take those birds and shove them into that. You can do it, right? Doesn't mean they're going to adapt well to it. That's a big trade-off to have to do that. So looking at what customers are looking for in the egg itself has to come into this dynamic of discussion. And my understanding, there are people certainly working on that front. Dr. Dina Jones is one, and she has done a lot of work in that. She's with USDA. Done a lot of work in egg quality, and I'm sure there's a lot of interaction going on that front right there. But these are things that producers are bringing up and say, hey, what do I do? Customer wants to hear, but I'm going to have to shove this hen into this system because it does, that they won't budge on the specs for the egg quality. So That's just one of those conundrums, right? You get into, and you got to say, well, we're working with a system here, folks. It all expands out. You have environmental effects, you've got labor effects, you got human health that has to be considered within this too, as well as animal health. You've got economic, impacts, food affordability impacts. You've got a whole spectrum of things that are happening within that system. And people are thinking, and one of the points that was made is people think differently about what sustainability is. We concentrate a lot on controlling greenhouse gases, the outputs from the system that might have impact on environmental quality, water quality, and so on. But then there's a larger scope of thought, from social justice to many things that in some respects producers might feel totally overwhelmed with trying to control themselves. So, you got to keep working at it and chipping away at it. And yes, there are always trade-offs when you make these changes, but I'm sensing, and some of the feedback that is coming back, for example, the mortality figures in cage-free seem to be going down. There's a very large study that was just published looking at 16 different countries. It was a meta-analysis of data. This came out of the Center for Animal Metrics that is based in Spain. And they said one of the things that they saw fall out was that the mortality in cage-free systems is getting lower. Well, part of that has to do with the experience that's being gained in those systems. Part of it might be the genetics of the hens that have changed up in those systems and the ability for people to actually manage those systems well.
A lot of variables in play there, and I appreciate you giving us a highlight of the research and look forward to touching base with you again as more research comes to light. Dr. Janice Swanson with Michigan State University, one of the speakers of the Midwest Poultry Convention in Minneapolis. Stay tuned for more of our coverage from the convention. You'll have it at Feedstuffs 365, and you can also follow via our social channels like Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. All of that more at feedstuffs.com or feedstuffs365.com. For Feedstuffs, I'm Andy Vance in Minneapolis.